let's see, where's my text? So Willem's chapter offers a lot of very interesting and important data, and he has just summarized very briefly the main trends. What I haven't read the paper, what I was a bit in need of, but I know that you still have a lot of rough things to polish, is how to put this in a more, let's say, in a larger picture, how to understand this, and especially when it comes to the political opportunity structure in the period that you cover, which is mostly post-World War II. So I call this a double Dutch paradox, and I think it is implicit and sometimes explicit in your paper. So the paradox is double. So on the one hand, the Netherlands is known for multiculturalism and wonderful, etc. And then Wilders came, and all of a sudden, so what the heck happened in the Netherlands? So that's one thing I think that could come up more to explain this. Secondly, I think that the paradox between, on the one hand, since the 1990s, a very negative discourse about migration and integration. And on the other hand, if you look at what is really happening on the ground, integration isn't doing that bad. And I think so that the chapter could need some more data on SAP, and I mean, that's not a big deal because it's all there. But I think to use these two paradoxes would give the chapter, I think, a more edge. I'm very glad that Willem puts his story in the long historical perspective of the Netherlands as one of the key players during what we as historians call the first phase of globalization, which is, let's say, the end of the 15th century until the beginning of the 19th century. Of course, I have to use this computer. The Netherlands, as you all know, had big ambitions globally. And this is from the 18th century, showing you the trade connection through the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch and the West Indian Company. So it was a major player. So the Netherlands has a very long tradition, not only of sending people out into the world, but also receiving immigrants. And you make that clear briefly. You cannot spend too much on it, but I think it's an interesting background, because the Netherlands has been a migration state in that sense for at least 4 or 5 centuries. And this is, if you look at, and Willem gives all kinds of figures in the paper, but maybe you could summarize it in a graph like this, to show, let's say, the share of foreign born. So this is the first generation. This is not because we don't have the data for second generation before 1800, and showing especially the 17th and 18th century as very important. And especially then, if you look at cities and you give the numbers for cities like Amsterdam, Leiden, sometimes over 50% of the population that is foreign born, around 1600 or 1650. Wow. So I think that this, let's say, is important for the long durée. Of course, what you see is at the end, after World War II, and that's your period of your chapter, is the globalizing of, well, let's say, the origins. Yeah. But again, the globalizing is limited to, on the one hand, people from the colonies, Suriname and the East Indies. And if you look at the rest of non-Europe, the rest of the world, it's mainly bordering regions of Europe. I mean, we're talking about Turkey and Morocco, which is just across the water from southern Europe. So I think that is helpful to that you do this. And then to the post-World War II period. I think it could need some more rigorous historization. And then, let's say, in the first phase, if you look at the first decades after World War II, it was very clear, you could stress that a little bit more, that, let's say, politicians openly declared we are not an immigration society. No, and we have too many people. We have 10 million people in 1950. That's too many. People have to leave. So there was a very active immigration policy. And as you mentioned in your chapter, 500,000 of the Dutch left for overseas destinations, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and what have you. Although you might also mention that 1/3 returned, but still. And this also explains how they dealt with the colonial immigration from the Dutch East Indies. I mentioned that yesterday, that very deliberately, let's say, so at the same time when almost 500,000 left, almost 500,000 came from the colony. So the politicians were totally frustrated. So they had this wonderful immigration policy, and at the same time, these stupid people from East Indies. Only they couldn't say that for, let's say, all kind of reasons. So that's also why they didn't label them as immigrants. They were repatriates, coming back to the. I explained that yesterday. I'm not going to repeat that, but I think it's important as a political frame to make that a little bit more clear. And at the same, and also the whole thing of the guest worker, but that's of course not specific for the Netherlands. The fact that this title was chosen was also to make very clear we're not an immigration country, these are guests and they are returners. But that was the, let's say, in this period, in the decades after World War II. Then, I think a second phase that should be highlighted as such is from the 1960s onwards. And what we in our book, 5 Centuries of Immigration, call the ethical revolution. Yeah? And which is part of this humanitarian turn and the cultural revolution, and so the awareness of the Holocaust, the awareness of racism, etc., so that you should not stigmatize migration. So this is, let's say, the start of this wonderful multicultural Dutch model, and which has a high political correctness, meaning that you have to be very careful not to stigmatize, let's say, immigrants or minorities. And also, what you could stress a little bit more is that there was a very broad consensus among politicians not to politicize immigration, to have this insular, I think it was mentioned yesterday as well in another context. And that was remarkable because in the same period you see the economic recession setting in, you see at the beginning of the recession the family reunification of Turks and Moroccans, and a huge second colonial immigration from Suriname. So if you would have come from Mars and you would have wanted to establish an extreme right anti-immigrant party, you would think this is the moment to enter the Netherlands and I'll have huge success. Some of them did, and you mentioned them, but of course they failed. And that's interesting because that shows how strong this ethical revolution and this political correctness at that moment was. Because this immigration happened at a very bad moment, when, let's say, there was mass unemployment, when, let's say, the people who were selected for very low or no skills from Morocco and Turkey were entering the country in massive numbers and ending up in the most worst quarters of the big cities. So, I mean, a worse starting point for integration you couldn't think of. Yeah? Yet, that was at that moment not possible to politicize it, and it was again until the end of the 1980s very broadly shared that you should not do this, from the right to the left. Yeah, so this is not just a left-wing thing. If you look at the most right-wing party, what they say about integration, it's almost if you read the Greens now. Right? It's a very interesting. So I think that is more important to highlight that a little bit better in order for people outside the Netherlands to understand what is happening. Yeah. Then I think the third period is starting at the end of the 1980s with the Rushdie affair. So these are Dutch Muslims taking to the streets in Rotterdam, demanding that the Dutch translation of the Satanic Verses will be banned, will be burned. And this was a kind of a wake-up call, especially in the beginning for the left. If you look at the reactions to these kind of demonstrations, it were, let's say, people from the left who were very, very outspoken anti-Muslim, saying, this is kind of a Trojan horse. We got them in and we took care of them, and now this is what you get. So, and it's not so strange that it comes from the left, because they had fought against religion, before gay rights and gender equality and free speech, and this was exactly what the opposite. So, and that also explains why the left since then has played a, let's say, peculiar role in the discussion, or in the discussion about integration. And that is also the end. This is where this ethical revolution evaporates. Yeah. And where after these first reactions from the left, you see that the right takes over and does a better job. and especially Bolkestein, the leader of the liberals, the right-wing liberals, introducing from this American-style class of civilizations concept in the 1990s, and he's the first politician in 1994 who openly breaks this consensus not to politicize, because then he starts politicizing, and immediately he is successful. Because before he put, let's say, this was in the asylum seekers period, put, let's say, the problems of Islam and migration on the agenda, I think 70% of the population thought this was a big problem. Within 3 weeks, it had risen to almost 29%. Yeah, so here you see also that it's not only just, let's say, showing what the people think, but also influencing very much public opinion from above. So I think this is something that could be brought in a little bit more. Of course, then we have Pim Fortuyn, and you see, by the way, on the right hand, this is the leader of the Social Democrats, who did a very bad job in the television discussion with Pim Fortuyn. And this is Islam is a backward religion. Pim Fortuyn, before he was murdered in 2002. This is where we're still in. Right? I think this is an important tipping point as well after the Rushdie affair. And further on, again, I already mentioned the role of the left, and you see that from the early 1990s on, the left is more or less more and more taking over this problematization of immigration and integration. You could say foreshadowing what the Danish Social Democrats have been developing to in the recent years, as we saw. And this is something not only for your chapter, but maybe for the book as a whole, that I'm not sure, Jim, where you want, because the chapters are all by country. And this is an interesting piece where David Goodhart, he was mentioned yesterday, so he's also coming from, I think, from Labour background, but also highly critical about immigration and integration, the somewheres and the anywheres, yes. And he did this piece together with the leader of the Dutch Social Democrats, Lodewijk Asscher. Yeah? So in the Independent and also in the Volkskrant in the Netherlands. And this is about Eastern European migration. And so there's this very alarmistic so that we will be taken over by Eastern Europe. This was 2013, well, nothing of the kind happened, of course, but it is illustrative of, let's say, this direction in the left. And again, to come back to this, so there are overarching transnational also movements in not only both on the left, I think, and on the right when it comes to attitudes towards immigration and integration. So this is not only a Dutch story, yeah, and also they borrow from each other. There's transfers of ideas, etc. So that's something maybe you should think of how to deal with this in the book. Then, because my time is almost up, let's say, of course, then. We have our famous Geert. So he took over from Bolkestein, as you all know. And this is, I mean, the last 20 years, and we still are in this period, yeah, where there's deep pessimism. So where there's optimism, which ended somewhere at the end of the 1980s, the pessimism took over, and of course, Geert Wilders has played a big role in it. And I think also here, maybe we should pay some more also attention to Cas Mudde, who has stressed how important the role of the media is in making this kind of movements big. How much attention has been given to these movements, and that really partly explains also their growth. And then very brief to the paradox. Okay, so you could imagine if you have heard this story well, poor immigrants. What about integration? That must have gone very wrong. If you look at what's really the trends, let's say how the children of immigrants do, I mean, and given, let's say, the very unlucky and bad timing of the immigration of their parents, well, there are huge upward social mobilities. I mean, 1/3 of these almost illiterate people from Turkey and Morocco, their children are doing higher education, universities, etc. 1/3. I mean, these are huge jumps. And this is something I think that could be stressed more. There's not that much integration in your chapter, but if you look at what we know about the trends, this is the paradox as well. So there's this huge anti-immigration broadly shared, because everyone is afraid to miss the next time. And at the same time, integration is going much better than most people realize. But finally, there is a radicalization going on in this pessimism, and Thierry Baudet on the left is a good example of this. Much more than Geert Wilders, he is catering the extreme right. He's Jared Taylor. He offered his dissertation to the old Le Pen. Milo is the one he's there on the photograph with Milo in the United States. So there's this radicalization, and although I don't think this will last, but it's interesting that he has, at least for the moment, he has some success with this. Then, very finally, emigration, you talked about that already, and this is a different, you only have let's say the balance line, and these are the entering and the leaving. You already did it in your presentation, but should do it more in the chapter, that are two very different concepts of emigration, I think. So the overseas emigration in the post-World War II period, and the much more very volatile mobility that you see people coming in and out of the Netherlands, both Dutch-born and non-Dutch-born, and especially within the EU. So this kind of internal migration within the EU. Leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Leo.